Order!
Tobacco and vapes bill.
Morning everybody, we'd like to keep public this evening that we broadcast before we begin. I would have a couple of preliminary announcements. Hansard colleagues would be grateful if members could email their speaking notes to hansardnotes@parliament.co.uk. I beg your pardon. Please switch electronic devices to silent. Teas and coffees are not allowed during sittings. Today we will first consider the programme motion on the amendment paper. We will then consider a motion to enable the reporting of evidence for publication and a motion to allow us to deliberate in private about our questions before the oral evidence session. In view of the time available, I hope we can take these matters formally without a debate. So, I first call the Minister or the Whip to move the programme motion standing in their name, which was discussed yesterday by the programming subcommittee for this bill.
I beg to move.
Thank you. The question is that the programme motion, as on the amendment paper, as many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the Minister to move the motion about written evidence.
I beg to move.
The question is the motion as on the amendment paper. I assume no one wants to speak. Good. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the Minister to move the motion about deliberating in private.
I beg to move.
The question is the motion as on the amendment paper. No one wishes to speak. Good. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Copies of written evidence which the committee receives will be made available in the committee room and will be circulated to members by email. We will now go into private session to discuss lines of questions. In public again, and proceedings are being broadcast. Before we start public hearings from the witnesses, do any members wish to make any declarations of interest in connections with this bill?
Thank you, Chair. An NHS consultant nutrition, and I'm also a member of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. My mother has some shareholdings in British American Tobacco, but that links to my parents having worked in Imperial Tobacco 50 years ago. It's just small.
As an officer of the Responsible Vaping All-Party Parliamentary Group.
Just as an NHS transplant and vascular surgeon, and my wife is a lung cancer doctor.
I'd like to declare an interest as a public health consultant and a member of the British Medical Association.
I want to declare an interest as a practicing pharmacist.
I can let you everything first of all, with whatever the buzz is that's happening. I just want to say I'm co-chair of the APPG on tobacco and smoking and health.
I declare an interest as Vice Chair of the APPG on tobacco and health.
That's it. I'm trying something. Yeah, it's sorry about the noise. It's slightly distracting as well, actually. So we're trying to sort that out. But thank you very much. So the first panel of witnesses are between effectively now and 10:25, and so thank you. So we begin by hearing oral evidence from Professor Sir Chris Whitty, Chief Medical Officer for England, Sir Francis Atherton, Chief Medical Officer for Wales, Professor Sir Michael McBride, Chief Medical Officer for Northern Ireland, who will be with us via Zoom, and Professor Sir Gregor Ian Smith, Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, for this panel. And as I said, we have until 10:25. So I call the first member.
And thank you, witnesses, for coming along today to hear what you've got to say about this bill. I've been particularly concerned about children vaping for some time. How will the restrictions to vaping in this bill, particularly colours, flavours and accessibility, help to reduce their appeal to children and their accessibility to children?
First. Well, first of all, thank you to the committee for inviting me to give evidence today. I think this is an incredibly important step in time, and I have been concerned.
Struggling to hear. I'm certainly struggling to hear. So if when you ask a question, could you enunciate a bit more clearly for everybody, and ditto if you could speak a little bit more loudly.
Sure. So if I can just test the volume levels just now, are people hearing me okay? So first of all, thank you for the invitation to provide evidence today. I think this is a really important step and that we can take to protect children from vaping. I'm very, very clear in my mind that vaping has a place in those who are already smoking to help them stop smoking. So it has a place in cessation of smoking. But children, young adults, and indeed adults who have never smoked should never start vaping. There are too many uncertainties about the health consequences of vaping to encourage that. This bill, I believe, particularly in the way that it will restrict access to vapes for children and reduce the attractiveness of vaping to children through some of the products which are currently marketed, will protect children from the potential health consequences of vaping itself, but also some of the emerging evidence that there is about vaping and the potential as a gateway into use of other nicotine products as well. So I'm very certain that the bill as it stands just now will help to protect children from the dangers that are associated with starting vaping in that age group.
Thank you. That's very helpful. My other question was about the difference between indoor and outdoor exposure to smoke. We have had in this country laws preventing smoking in certain indoor spaces for quite some years now. How does the exposure to smoke inside differ from perhaps outside, sitting next to someone on a park bench or in a restaurant at a neighbouring table? What are the comparative health risks between those two, please?
I think the first thing to say is that second-hand smoke is a very serious problem, and I think is underestimated in the general public because if I'm honest, because the cigarette industry has been very successful in muddying the waters on this. The key things that really make a difference are three, the first of which is the degree of concentration of smoke. The second is the duration of exposure. So obviously if you are exposed for longer, let's say you're sitting next to someone for half an hour, it's more than if it's just a couple of minutes. But the third is the vulnerability of the people who are being exposed to it. And this is, I think, one of the things which this bill will help with. So there are now over 88% of the population do not smoke. There are roughly 6 million smokers still. There are significantly more people in the UK non-smokers who have vulnerabilities, medical vulnerabilities, that mean that the smoke is particularly dangerous to them. It may be acutely, so things like asthma, they can be exposed to smoke and have an asthma attack, and that lands them in hospital. That in severe cases can even land them in really very dangerous situation. Or it may be a chronic situation. For example, people living with diabetes already have a disease which is going to accelerate things like cardiovascular disease. If people are smoking on top of them, it will accelerate them still further. So outdoor smoking, whilst less in terms of passive smoking than indoor smoking, in most situations, if you're close to someone, if you're exposed for a long period, if you're vulnerable, can actually have very significant health impacts. And in broad terms, if you can smell smoke, you're being exposed to significant amounts of smoke. And that is one of the things which this bill is aiming to address. I would like to just make one additional point, which is the cigarette industry has been extraordinarily good at trying to pretend that to be pro-smoking is to be pro-choice. Nothing could be further from the truth. Firstly, smoking is highly addictive, and most people who are smokers wish they'd never started and want to quit, but they are trapped by addiction. Their choice has been taken away deliberately by these companies as part of their policy. And if you're talking about second-hand smoke, whether indoors or outdoors, the person downwind or next door who had that smoking had no choice at all at any point. They're being exposed to the risks with no advantages at all. So if you're pro-choice, you should be very, very firmly in favour of the principles of this bill. Frank, do you want to add to that?
Well, absolutely. The only thing I would add is that there's no safe level of smoking. As Chris says, if you smell it, you're breathing it in, and there is no safe level. Obviously, indoors is worse than outdoors, and the dose response is a big issue, but there's no safe level. I think that's a really important point.
Anybody else? Yes, sir, Bo.
I just want to ask, because you were saying only sort of about 88% of the population don't smoke, and the numbers are actually now declining. Can I ask why you supported a generational ban as opposed to just raising the age from like 18 to 21 or even 25? Because it's normally predominantly younger people who want to stop smoking. So why do that rather than...
I might ask Michael to come in, but I can have a first go, and then Michael, maybe you might want to come after that, because this is a really critical point. Firstly, the cigarette industry, historically, despite what it claims, has always targeted children. They always deplore it in public, and if you look at their internal documents, you discover this is what they've been aiming to do. And most people, the great majority actually of people, will start before they're 20, i.e. as teenagers. You are of course correct. They're now doing the same thing, back to Dr. Johnson's original question, with vaping. They're following exactly the same playbook. You get people at their most vulnerable and you addict to them. That is their aim. However, were we to stop at, let's say, 21, the cigarette industry, which is extraordinarily good at regrouping around whatever the regulations in place are, would simply regroup around 21. And to go back to my very first point about addiction, if you're a 21-year-old and you start, you become addicted and then you wish you'd stopped. That doesn't change the fact that your choice has been taken away. So the logic of saying 21 or 25 or 30, various people have looked at various ages, is no better than the logic of the current situation. And the advantage of the current model, which actually was first put forward by a Conservative Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, to whom I think we should all pay great tribute on the basics of this bill, was to ensure that current children are not addicted and have their choice taken away, but rights are not taken away from existing smokers. And that's the reason why this particular model was chosen. Michael, do you want to add to that? You're on mute.
We can't hear. Start here. We'll come back. We'll come back to you in a moment. Andrew Quinn.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, CMOs. I would like to start by asking about the additions to the bill, because, of course, this is a reincarnation, as Professor Whitty says, of an earlier bill from the previous government, but we have sought to go further. What impact do you in your professional opinion, think that the additions to the bill will have in terms of public health benefits for the four nations?
May I take one that extends my previous points about outdoor smoking, and then maybe pass on to Sir Gregor and Sir Frank? For the outdoor smoking, so the previous bill, which I think was a very good bill that was put forward by the previous government, did not have anything which actually addressed the needs of current smokers, but also did not have things that were addressing the needs of people who are exposed to smoke, despite the fact they themselves, like over 88% of the population, are not smokers, and many of those are medically vulnerable. So this bill allows the government to take powers with additional, firstly, consultation, public consultation, and then additional measures in Parliament to take powers to prevent outdoor smoking. And the ministers, as you, Minister, have obviously demonstrated in the House of Commons, have indicated the areas where they intend to use these powers, which are the areas of the greatest vulnerability to reduce the risks of passive smoking. So around hospitals, because this is an area where some of the most medically vulnerable are highly concentrated, around children's playgrounds, because this is where children are, and I think everybody would agree, who doesn't actually have shares in cigarette companies, that exposing children to second-hand smoke is an unacceptable thing to do. So that is one area where the bill has gone further than the previous one. Maybe Sir Frank might want to add to that.
Well, actually, in Wales, in terms of smoke-free places, of course, we've had smoke-free hospitals, schools, play areas since 2021 under our earlier public health legislation, and it's completely non-controversial. I mean, there are clearly issues around implementation and enforcement, particularly around hospitals. But if you go now to schools and hospitals, there's no controversy whatsoever. So that won't make a huge amount of difference in Wales. But the one thing I think will make a difference is aligning the vaping with the smoking legislation. And the reason I say that is because, back to the earliest question, vape use among young people in Wales has absolutely shot up over recent years. It's gone from 8% of 11. It's now 8% of 11 to 16-year-olds regularly vape, and that was 5 and a bit percent in 2021. So it's absolutely shot up, and the bringing vaping and tobacco legislation in terms of vape-free and smoke-free places is a really important thing, which I've been arguing for quite some time. Thank you.
Ministers, officials have worked really hard across the four nations to put together a piece of legislation that is relevant to all four nations. How important do you think it is that this bill extends powers and responsibilities on public health across the four nations together?
If I perhaps begin this answer, my colleagues may want to come in. Alignment is really important in this respect. Alignment, partly because of the clarity of message that exists to the public around about what is legally acceptable in relation to smoking and to vaping, but also alignment across both tobacco smoking and vape use as well, I think is similarly important across the four nations. Public health messaging is incredibly important. Public health messaging, having a consistent message across our four nations, I think helps to ensure that the message is much more clearly understood and adhered to by the public in this respect. So I welcome the attempts that have been made by ministers to make sure that that alignment exists within this bill, so that we, as we go forward, we give this protection to those who don't smoke. In the way that we are planning and doing with the bill as it proceeds. One of the most important aspects of this for me is to make sure that, for instance, in Scotland, although we have at this present time legislation which prevents smoking in the likes of public places such as outside a hospital within 15 metres, bringing that much more closely in line with where the Welsh position is, to the whole of the hospital grounds, extending it to protect as Sir Chris has said, to more vulnerable places such as play parks is something which in Scotland I would certainly welcome. And to do that in step across the four nations, I again emphasise that public messaging is incredibly important in making sure we get the kind of adherence that we would seek with it.
Thank you. If I can turn to two of the issues that were raised at second reading in terms of criticisms of the bill, to get your views on this. We've already touched on some of the libertarian arguments, but I would just like to know from the three of you that whether you think the issue of choice is addressed by this bill, whether you have any kind of sympathy with the libertarian argument, or whether you think that actually this bill and tackling tobacco and child vaping is something that the libertarian argument doesn't stand up.
Well, I've already, I think, given my view that although I have a lot of sympathy for choice and freedom arguments in many situations, tobacco addiction is not one of those, and second-hand smoking is not one of those. But maybe Sir Frank might want to add to it.
Choice is undermined by the addictive nature. Nicotine is incredibly addictive. We know that now. We've known it for many years, actually. The tobacco industry has known it for many years, and that's why the tobacco industry, through vaping and through other means, is quite keen, I think, to have the next generation of people in our countries addicted to nicotine. So choice is completely undermined, and it's taken away by the addictive nature of the product being marketed.
I mean, I'd like to say something about this as well, because nicotine addiction is horrific. Nearly 9,000 people a year still die in Scotland as a result of tobacco-related health issues. 2/3 of people who begin smoking are potentially at risk of dying as a consequence of their addiction to this. And we know that the industry targets people both at a younger age spectrum, but also from vulnerable groups as well in relation to how they sustain their industry as well. So the choice argument for me, if you've ever spoken to a patient with a serious tobacco-related illness, with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, who are now suffering the consequences of that, the limited ability to be able to live their life as a consequence of that, and the addictive nature of the disease that they've had, you soon begin to learn that they are filled with nothing but regret and guilt as well for the part that their addiction has played in the development of the disease. The stigma that's associated with tobacco-related disease is quite terrible for those who experience it, and the basis of that is this lack of choice that they have developed as a consequence of the addictive nature of the nicotine products.
If I could just add a specific example from... Sorry.
We go further. I'm trying to establish whether Sir Michael McBride has got contact with us yet, but we don't know unless you speak, and we'll know whether we've got the connection on it. It's as simple as that, really, at the moment.
Yes, well, the problem isn't on my side, so I've asked that you unlock me, so I think I've now been unlocked, so yes. Perhaps I can speak.
Yes, so
apologies for...
That's fine. So we've now got connection with Mission Control. So Chris, do you want to finish up?
Illustration of this, because I think it is such a fundamental point. I can remember, and I suspect this is something which all of my colleagues who are doctors on the panel will know, as well as on this side of the table. I can remember the first time I was a vascular surgery house officer, watching people who'd had one leg chopped off because they'd been smoked, weeping as they had to take another cigarette, which was inevitably going to lead to their next leg being chopped off, and incidentally smoking over people coming into the hospital as they came in. It's an appalling addiction, and I think people who say this is about choice have never met someone who is seriously addicted to smoking.
do you have any observations or comments to make, given that we've now got connection with you, in relation to any of the points that have been raised?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and apologies for the connection problems earlier. Just following on from Sir Chris's comments there, I think that all of us who have worked as clinicians in the front line, and know members of the committee have also experienced that as well, know only too well the horrors of smoking tobacco and the premature death, the illnesses that it causes, and the impact that it has on the next generations. We know, for instance, that despite the fall that there has been in smoking, as per one of the earlier questions from the committee, there are still 127,000 people each year in the United Kingdom who start smoking cigarettes as a result of the effectiveness of the tobacco industry in their marketing and blatant marketing of children and young people, not just with tobacco and nicotine products, but also with vapes. I too have seen at first hand the impacts of that. I know as someone whose father was a smoker who died of an acute myocardial infarct, aged 46 years of age, the impacts that it actually has on children as well, on the next generation, who are 3 times more likely themselves to take up smoking tobacco. So this is a once-in-a-generational lifetime opportunity, and I think we collectively need to seize this opportunity to prevent future harms for those who are most vulnerable, for children, young people, and future generations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, can I have the running order here, so can I go to Gregory Stafford first, please, and then I'll move over to this side.
Thank you, Chairman. Could you just tell us whether you have any concerns about the impact on vapes as a smoking cessation tool, given this? Obviously, as my colleague has said, vaping for children is abhorrent, and I'm glad the bill is addressing this. But how can we ensure that, as a cessation tool, vapes still remain part of that panoply of options for smokers trying to give up?
Thank you, Chair. I think that it's a very important question, and I think everybody would agree that on 2 things, and then there's a way of just making sure we get the exact middle point on this argument. The first is, as you imply, I think in this country, it's not actually universally true, but in this country, there is a strong view that we should try and continue our support to allow smokers who are current smokers and are finding it very difficult to get off because of their addiction, which has taken their choice away, to move to vaping as a step in the right direction. So I think that is broadly accepted in this country. As I say, there are some countries where that is not accepted, so to be clear, this is not a universal view. At the other extreme, as you imply, as you say, state directly actually, I think everybody would agree that the marketing of vapes to children is utterly abhorrent. And I think almost everybody would agree that marketing vapes to people who are current non-smokers, given we do not know what the long-term effects of these are, because we've not had them for long enough, is a big mistake, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to get into a position where we regret in 20 years not having taken action on those. So the question is, how do you get the balance? And in my view, this is sometimes made more complicated than it needs to be. And I think it can be very simply summarised, which is if you smoke, vaping is safer. If you don't smoke, don't vape. And vape marketing to children is utterly abhorrent. That's it. And I think it's sometimes made a lot more convoluted. Now, I think our view, I think, is that this bill gets that balance right. In general, if people's profession is getting people who are current smokers off, they tend to be more on the pro-vaping end because they see the dangers of current smokers. And people who deal with children, for example, Dr. Johnson, who's had to take great leadership on this area, the Royal College of Paediatrics, she's very much in the centre of her profession, take a very, very strong anti-vape view because they've seen the effects of children being affected. So it's getting the balance between those two, and I think that this bill does that. But, and it's important but, the bill takes powers in this area, and that does mean that if we go too far in one direction or too far in the other, there is the ability to adjust that with consultation and with parliamentary sort of secondary legislation. So that does allow for the ability to move around that if it looks as if we've not got the point exactly right. It may also change over time as the evidence evolves.
Move on to Becky Cooper as the next question, please.
Being here, and my question is around inequalities and how you think the bill will be effective or otherwise in reducing inequalities And are there any areas of the UK that have specific challenges that you'd like to highlight related to tackling smoking prevalence?
It's Michael.
Thank you for that question. Thank you, Chair. I think this is a really important question, and we talked before about the blatant marketing of tobacco and vapes. There is also the preying of the industry on those more socioeconomically deprived areas. So if we look at smoking rates in those more socioeconomically deprived areas, it's 2 to 3 times higher than less socioeconomically deprived areas. If we consider the death rate from smoking-related conditions, it's twice as high. And if we look at lung cancer rates, it's 2.5 times as high in those areas. And that is as a direct consequence of smoking incidents in more socioeconomic deprived areas. So the health inequalities associated with the consumption of tobacco are significant. Great. If we look at smoking in pregnancy and all of the consequences with that in terms of premature birth, stillbirth, low birth weight, we see that smoking in women from more socioeconomically deprived areas is 4.5 times higher than in those less socioeconomically deprived areas. So the health inequalities argument here and the case to be made in terms of addressing this within this bill is huge. And I think this is an opportunity that we must not pass up in terms of actually narrowing the adverse health consequences. I don't know, Chris, if you want to add more to that.
So it's my very clear view that the provisions within the bill will help us to tackle some of the inequalities that are associated with particularly tobacco smoking. If I look at the situation in Scotland, 26% of our lowest socio-economic group are smokers, compared to 6% of our highest socio-economic group. And the gradient that Sir Michael has spoken about in terms of the subsequent tobacco-related disease that those groups then experience is really quite marked, whether that be cardiovascular disease, whether that be the numerous cancers that are associated with smoking. All of these can be addressed by trying to tackle the scourge of these tobacco companies in particular preying on more vulnerable groups within our society, whether that be those who experience socio-economic circumstances which are much more difficult for them, challenging for them, whether that be particular groups who are more likely to experience mental health conditions as well. All of these must be tackled and people assisted not to develop those addictions which lead to lifelong smoking and problems with their health thereafter. And I'm very clearly of the view that both in terms of smoking, but also I think it's important to say vaping, the targeting of those groups that create those inequalities within our society is something which this bill can address.
Hassan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the evidence submissions so far. Will the bill's restriction of flavours for vaping products prevent the appeal to children and ex-smokers if they can no longer access such products, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the issue of flavours, colours, speaks to the issue of marketing towards children that we've been speaking about so far. I've got no reason to believe that taking away colours, taking away flavours, which are appealing to children, would remove vaping as a stop smoking tool. It remains a tool, an important one in the box that we have to have alongside nicotine replacement therapy, alongside education, but it will remain an important tool to stop people smoking. But the prime aim, of course, here is to stop the marketing towards children. What we've seen over recent years is, if you remember, think back to when tobacco was advertised in shops, the big gantries that you saw in shops. We now have vape gantries in almost all of our shops. So taking away that marketing opportunity towards children, the colourful, the flavoursome displays, can only be a benefit to reducing childhood vaping and reducing the nicotine dependency, which is coming as a consequence of that.
Yeah, and I think we should let's be really clear about this. The vaping industry will claim it is not marketing to children whilst putting in flavours, colours, cartoons and placements that are clearly aimed at children. And you just look at them, you don't need anything else, and then you see the rates going up in children. So it is very clear they are doing this needs to be tackled.
But if I could just add to that, Chair, I think that, if you look at products named such as Gummy Bear, Rainbow Surprise, who are they actually aiming these products at? We did research here, our public health agency, with children and young people in Northern Ireland, both focus groups and online surveys, over 7,500 children. 77% of them told us that what appealed to them about vapes was the colours and flavourings. And if we look at the consultation, the public consultation, it had the strongest and highest support for banning flavours and colourings of 75%, over 75% of the population in Northern Ireland supported that ban. So I think that we should not be deluding ourselves about what the exploitative marketing of these products. Obviously, in terms of next steps, it is really, really important that those who want to use vapes to quit, as Sir Frank has said, continue to access those, and we will consult carefully. The government undoubtedly will consult carefully on those measures to ensure that we do not, as the question is rightly exploring, restrict access or discourage individuals for using vapes to quit smoking.
When comparably, how addictive is nicotine in tobacco and vapes compared to other products? So I seem to remember it's harder to get off nicotine than methadone. Is that true?
Gregor? I'm not sure I would have data or evidence that would back that up. I've certainly heard people claim that in the past, that the addictive nature of nicotine. And one of the important aspects of this is the re-emergence of the addiction by small exposures after people have managed to quit is very rapid and very quick as well. So certainly we should be in no doubt about the addictive nature of nicotine, and also the risk, going back to the harmful effects of passive smoking or being in company of people who smoke, the risks that are associated with the re-emergence of that addiction and the emergence of people's habits in terms of tobacco smoking is something that is very, very real. So therefore, the best protection is never to start in the first place, and if we can prevent people from taking those first nicotine products and prevent the addiction from forming in the first place, there is a much greater chance, obviously, that they're not going to suffer the health consequences.
Right.
It is clear, I think, for child vaping and the comments made about display and advertising, that it is an issue that needs to be tackled. I think it's an issue that many of our constituents and many people in the country recognise. I think especially for adult smokers, do you believe that there is going to be any impact to the display and packaging restrictions in reducing the effectiveness of vapes as a tobacco cessation tool?
Okay, well, our view is that the benefits in terms of preventing people who currently are not vaping, and particularly children from vaping, for what is being proposed in this bill significantly exceed that risk. But that risk exists, we all accept that, and that, to go back to a previous point I made, is why having this in powers has the advantage that if it does look as if, as a result of where we get to, but of course remembering this is going to be after consultation, so there will be consultation beforehand, there will be secondary legislation through Parliament, but if after that it looks as if we've gone too far, it would be possible to ease back as a result of that. Our view, though, is at this point in time, and subject to what the consultation shows, the net benefit in public health terms is positive for this prevention of children starting smoking over any risk of of adults. I think the area where the greatest uncertainty around it is on flavours, actually, and there is some genuine debate around that with a range of different views from people who are quite seriously trying to wrestle with this problem rather than doing marketing masquerading as wrestling with this problem. But I think in all other areas, most people think that the benefit outweighs the risk.
Thank you very much. Zubir Ahmed.
Sir Chris, your anecdote about the vascular ward does resonate strongly with me as a practicing vascular surgeon, and many of my patients leave hospital with less legs than they entered generally. But the comment I want to make and ask you to make comment upon is the chronic disease burden. As you all know, there's an epidemic of chronic disease in our country, and it's rising, and it's probably going to require various public health measures to get that back under control. I wonder if I could ask you to make some comment about how you feel the impact of this legislation might impact upon the chronic disease burden on the NHS going forward, not only in the short term but in the long term.
Thank you. So I'll give a view, and Sir Gregor, I think, will want to add to it. I mean, it will make a very substantial difference to this. I think the thing to understand is not only does cigarette smoking cause individual diseases, many people, as they grow through life, have multiple diseases around smoking. So they will start off with, let's say, heart disease as a result of their smoking. They will go on to have a variety of possible cancers. They might have chronic obstructive airways disease. They will end up potentially with dementia. All of these would have been either not happened at all or would have been substantially delayed had they not smoked. And of course, this is heavily weighted towards areas of deprivation, people living with mental health conditions, and other areas where it's really unjust, I think most people would consider in society. So I think all of us, and I think anybody who's looked at this in public health terms would say, if you could remove smoking from the equation, the burden of chronic disease would go down very substantially and be delayed. And the inequalities of that burden of disease would also be eroded. So the arguments for this, I think, are really clear. Just to give some kind of indication of the kinds of numbers that are involved, we have thousands every year, millions over time of people are going into hospitals and general practices only because they're smoking. And had they not smoked, they would not have to go to use the NHS, and they would not have the chronic disease burden that disbenefits themselves, disbenefits their families, and of course, because of the impact on the wider society, disbenefits everyone else as well. So there is enormous impact to this, and it will undoubtedly, this bill, if it is passed by Parliament, will reduce that. Gregor, do you want to add to that?
So thank you for raising this as a question, because I think it's a very important point to understand. And certainly, I will speak to the experience in Scotland, but the Scottish Burden of Disease study published by Public Health Scotland suggests that from now to 2043 in Scotland, we're going to see a rise of 21% in the overall burden of disease across our society. That burden of disease is very much weighted towards a number of conditions such as cancer, such as dementia, including vascular dementia, such as cardiovascular disease. And others. And there is no doubt in my mind that smoking contributes to those, and anything that we can do to reduce that burden of disease across society. Chris's point about the multimorbidities that people experience is really important in this context. There are more people in Scotland who experience multimorbidity under the age of 50 even than over the age of 50. So much of that is smoking related. Anything that we can do to reduce that burden of disease on people will not only will not only make their own lives so much more productive and better, and be able to spend more productive time with their families. They'll be economically active for longer, and they will also be less having to use kind of health services as well. So there is both a health and an economic argument here, which I think is compelling, around about the preventative nature of stopping smoking, or stopping people beginning smoking, which is really important to understand in the context of that projected increase in the burden of disease. The one last thing is to remember that our experience of disease can sometimes be cumulative. So people, for instance, who have developed diabetes for other reasons, as Sir Chris has already alluded to, but who smoke as well, will have accelerated disease as a consequence of that. And again, removing what we can step by step, the risks that are associated with the development of that accelerated disease, you will have seen it very clearly in your role as a vascular surgeon. But removing what we can, the development of that disease has to be a step that we take to maintain both the health of our nation but also the economic prosperity of our nation as well.
Just to put some numbers, sorry, the numbers which I was looking for.
Sorry, Sir Chris, just a second. Just for the purposes of timekeeping, which is my job, we have about 20 minutes left. I have 5 people who wish to ask questions, so if you can keep the questions as tight as possible and within reason the answers as well. Sir Chris. Chris, you want to...
Thank you. I just wanted to give the exact numbers, or I just found them in my notes. 75,000 GP appointments a month caused by smoking. Just think of that when you phone up the GP. And 448,000 admissions to the NHS. Again, think of that when you look at these areas. So the impact of this is really very substantial.
Thank you very much. If I could just ask a question about some of the arguments from tobacco companies for heated tobacco products to be excluded from the tobacco regulations in the bill, and presumably therefore the age of sale regulations. Would you have a view on whether that's a sensible proposal or not?
I have a very strong view. Tobacco industry is extraordinarily adept at pretending that it's on the side of the angels and that it's trying to help with the problem. This goes along with slimline cigarettes, filters, low-tar cigarettes, many other marketing things, all of which claim to be to try and help with the health effects. Tobacco is extraordinarily dangerous as well as being addictive. And the heated tobacco products have probably slightly lower levels, or they do have lower levels of the multiple chemicals that are toxic, multiple, not just one or two, but they are way away from safe levels. So therefore, heated tobacco products, whilst arguably, if someone had exactly the same amount, being slightly lower in terms of the risk, is a long way short of anywhere near safe, and they are still addictive. And they also have some side blow areas where they will have some issues for people around them as well. So the idea that this is some kind of solution, it only makes sense if you have shares in the company. So I would very strongly argue against trying to exclude these and carve these out. Does anyone...
Comments?
Well, I'm just... It's back to that point that nicotine is addictive, however you take it, whether it's in heated tobacco, whether it's in cigarettes, whether it's in snus, whether it's in chewed tobacco, whether it's in shisha pipes. So in terms of protecting the next generation, I think the great value of this bill is the flexibility to deal with not just the issues that we see in front of us, but the things which may well come down the pipeline in the future. So I believe the bill is flexible enough to allow us to protect the next generation from this terrible problems that are coming from addiction that we've just been describing. Thank you.
Michael, you were nodding. Did you have any comment to make?
Yeah, I mean, I just echo Sir Frank's comments in terms of the flexibility that this bill affords us, and to again confirm my agreement with Sir Chris's comments. I mean, let us be clear: there is no product, no other product, that causes life-limiting addiction that kills two-thirds of the people who use it. It is quite staggering, and this bill provides us an opportunity to address a scourge on our society, and there is no safe tobacco product, none.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Tristan Osborne.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question concerning the specific issue of vapes, and you mentioned earlier there's a lack of, because it's a new product, there's a lack of scientific consensus about the medium to long-term effects. Are we going to see publications around this over the next 5-10 years, or maybe sooner? Presumably there's been testing on these products, clinical trials. So can you tell me the difference perhaps between the two? Because I accept fully the tobacco legislation. My concern is the evidence base for the vapes and the potential for a cobra effect where we actually might see people then go back to tobacco-based products because they're cheaper to purchase. And the second evidence of this is that in the RPC report it says that we're expecting a 12% reduction in vaping in a similar to tobacco-based products. Is that a reasonable assumption based on the fact that there's been a long-standing public awareness of tobacco versus perhaps a lack of awareness around the complexities of vaping products?
Michael, like to go first.
Yes, well, thank you for the important question. But I think that you're quite right that the evidence on the harmful effects of vapes potentially harmful effects of vapes is still developing, and we are not at the stage that we are with our knowledge of tobacco. Certainly, vapes, as we've said already, the effects and harmful effects of vapes are likely to be significantly less and are significantly less than tobacco, but are unlikely to be zero. This is an area which there's ongoing research. We know that the WHO has raised concerns about the potential impact, particularly in children, in terms of brain development. I know you will hear more about that later from other panelists. So I think this is something which we will obviously need to continue to keep under review. The bill does provide us the opportunity to introduce further measures should that be required. However, I think in all of this there's a need for balance, and obviously government is, certainly the Northern Ireland Assembly, when it will be debating this in the coming weeks, will wish to ensure that there is a balance between ensuring that vapes are accessible to individuals to assist cessation of smoking and help them quit, but also that we are guided by the evidence to ensure that any legislation that is introduced is proportionate. And I think that is incumbent on all of us at this time, and certainly should further evidence of harmful effects become available, then obviously there is the opportunity and flexibility on the bill to look at this again.
I think I'd only add that it took us some decades to work out the extraordinary impact of smoking, and much of this just tends to be cumulative over time. So you don't see the major effects of someone starting to smoke in their 20s till they're in their 50s, 60s and 70s. What we don't want to be is in 20 years' time looking back and saying, we knew these were addictive, we knew that the people were smoking things that go into the lungs are much more dangerous than things you eat for a variety of different reasons. Just basing it on lab studies is not a safe way to proceed. And so I think all of us were therefore thinking the sensible thing to do, whilst maintaining them as a smoking quit age, is to avoid a situation that people who are currently not smokers take up vapes, because they will definitely get addicted, the nicotine is there, and there is a high chance, in our view, that they will have harms, although the size of those harms is currently difficult exactly to put a number on over time. Some people come to extreme harms quite quickly, actually, but those numbers are fortunately relatively small.
Curtis.
Off what my colleague and yourselves were talking about, specifically in vaping, I'm trying to drill into your confidence levels on this flexibility that you talk about in the legislation, because as has been indicated, and you've talked all very eloquently about, there obviously isn't as much of an evidence base when it comes to vaping for all the reasons you've outlined, but whilst recognising somewhat the genie's out the bottle, if we're thinking of a new car or a new product in the market, it will go through a lot of testing before it's put out there in order to ensure it's safe. Now, as I say, I recognise the genie's out the bottle in that regards, but why should we not be ensuring that the sort of evidence underpinning vaping and the sort of integrity and safety for public health is not as rigorous, and therefore putting in the most stringent, and therefore should this bill go further in terms of putting in more stringent requirements in that regard until we have confidence in the impact on public health across all our 4 nations?
So, very difficult to disentangle the evidence just now around about vaping, isn't it? Because so many of the people who are currently vaping are either current or ex-smokers as well. And to do some form of longitudinal study which actually gets to develop the evidence base for any potential harm that is caused by vaping is something which is difficult, although there are attempts to try to do that, such as through our Future Health study just now. At this moment, I think the bill and the provisions within the bill represents a proportionate and reasonable approach with the flexibility that exists within it to be able to respond as new evidence develops, either towards or against the harms which are associated with vaping. I think it's proportionate in that it maintains vaping as a potential tool in the armoury to help people stop smoking, but similarly is proportionate in making sure that the abhorrent marketing of vapes to children, which Sir Chris has already mentioned, and the position, which I think is correct, which if you've never started vaping or never started smoking, you shouldn't, that it allows that as well. So I think that the proportionality of the provisions just now is something in the right direction, but with the ability to be able to flex in the future as future evidence emerges.
We've got one more question, which is, I'm afraid, probably the last question to this set of witnesses, and it's Liz Jarvis.
I'd like to understand more about how you think that the gradual change in age of sale will affect the impact on tobacco and vaping behaviour compared with increasing the age of sale in one go. And the reason for that is obviously because if a child has an older sibling or someone who may be bringing the products into the home or older friends or something, I don't see how this is going to change the behaviour or the desire to try the products.
I think it's important to be realistic about the fact that actually under the current law, and all of you will remember this from your school days, I suspect, and if you've got children will know it from them, people don't stick exactly to the law as it is. So this idea that magically there's going to be a cut-off and people will exactly follow that strikes me as flying in the face of lived reality. But actually, as the thing moves up over time, I'm very confident this will lead to a significant reduction over time in the number of children who are buying cigarettes, because it will be illegal for people to sell them to them. It won't be illegal for them to possess them. That's an important distinction, but it will be illegal for people to sell them to them. And if you're a 17-year-old, you can usually pretend to be an 18-year-old. Pretending or even wanting to pretend to be a 30-year-old is a different thing completely. So over time, this will become more effective. The impacts of this will first be seen in things like children's asthma and developing lungs. It'll probably next be seen actually in birth effects, because the highest smoking rates are in the youngest mums. So the rates are up to 30% in people who have children before they're 20, much lower to people if they have them in their late 20s or early 30s. So in this cohort, the effects in terms of stillbirth, in terms of birth defects, in terms of premature births, and so on, that will be the next, I think, big impact it'll have, and then gradually it'll roll over time. Now, it's not a perfect mechanism. I don't think any piece of law that's been designed is a perfect mechanism, but as a way of gradually driving this down, but in a way that does not take away anyone's existing rights, this, I think, seems to me a reasonable balance between those principal aims. And the borderline, to go back to my first point, in reality will probably be a bit fuzzy, because it always is, but over time I think the effects will be very substantial.
I'm got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask Mary Kelly-Foy to ask a very brief question and a very short answer. I'm sorry, because we'll be finishing spot on 10:25. Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the restricting vapes in public places, do you have, which is obviously a very welcome power, do you have any view on how that should be implemented so that it doesn't deter smokers from switching to vapes or relapsing back into smoking cigarettes?
I'm going to suggest Frank takes it, because this is his very last answer to a parliamentary question. He's about to stop as Chief Medical Officer, so he's going out on a high.
So I think what the bill does, it just simplifies matters, making it as simple as possible, where a smoke-free place is a vape-free place as well. It doesn't take away the ability of people to go into a place where smoking is allowed and where vaping is allowed, but it really helps to disentangle the confusion that currently exists about where people can legitimately use these products. So I think it's a simplification which can only help to lead in the long term to that reduction that we need. We currently have in Wales 13% of people continue to smoke. Our ambition is to get to 5% by 2030. We're going to struggle to get there, but this bill will help us to get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm afraid that draws this particular session to a close. So can I ask our witnesses Sir Chris Whitty, Sir Francis Atherton, Sir Gregor Smith and Sir Michael McBride for their attendance and their helpful contributions and, of course, the helpful questions from members. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
It is.
We're trying to fix it, yeah. They thought it might be to do with the Zoom, so that's why we have to wait until the end.
Maybe I saw Greg and Redford's make it.
Here you go, guys. Let's see.
Which is not electric.
Can we move on, please? Thank you very much. Thank you. Now the evidence from Sheila Duffy, Chief Executive of Action on Smoking and Health Scotland, Suzanne Cash, Chief Executive of ASH Wales, and Naomi Thompson, Health Improvement Manager at Cancer Focus Northern Ireland. So we have till 10:55 for this panel. Now I call on the first member to ask the question, and who might that be? Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, all. As we know, this is a resurrected bill from the previous government with additional measures. How do you think that this bill compares with the previous iteration?
For your question, Minister Gwynne. We're really all delighted to see this bill return and in such a strong form. Complete consensus across the ashes of the four nations that this is a bill that is needed, wanted and workable. And as the Chief Medical Officer was saying in the previous session, the improvements that have come through in this bill is that it has more provisions in there that will assist in reducing smoking among people who are already smoking and protecting those exposed to secondhand smoke. But also it creates a very comprehensive set of regulations around all tobacco and nicotine products and provides us with that future-proof, the flexibility to be able to respond to evidence as it emerges and changes and the market as it emerges and changes over time. So, the bill is enormously welcome in its kind of comprehensiveness, in its robustness, and the opportunity, therefore, to significantly reduce the uptake of smoking among the next generation, aid people in quitting. And I know the Minister will not mind me saying I think there is more that the government will need to do to accelerate that progress in terms of investing in support for those who are already smoking and ensuring that we have the right strategy in place for that. But the bill is a really good step in that right direction.
Thank you. In terms of tobacco control measures, what impact have they had to date over time, and what impact do you expect this bill to have in addition to those?
We have seen that tobacco control measures work. We have seen that over time they have reduced adult smoking rates. I think the points made by the Chief Medical Officers were well made. We are looking to the generation growing up now in the UK. We are looking to protect them from addictions that so many now regret and that are claiming lives unnecessarily.
I think I'd like to add to that as well that tobacco control policies that you put in place are popular and really welcome amongst members of the public. and also welcomed amongst people who smoke as well. So there is a huge surge of public support for tobacco control policies, and that grows. It doesn't diminish as we introduce new policies. It actually grows, and that public support increases.
And certainly, as we're working towards, certainly in Northern Ireland, to a smoke-free Northern Ireland by 2035, the reality is tobacco control in the past 10 years has managed to bring it down to a stage where by 2035 that's potential. So that's why tobacco control needs to continue, and a bill like this is just brilliant to keep that focus. And if we can prevent people from starting, that is absolutely key to making Northern Ireland certainly smoke-free by then.
If I can ask the question of Suzanne Cass. We heard from the CMO for Wales just in the session before that the extension of smoke-free to outdoor places such as hospitals, playgrounds and outside schools is already in place in Wales. What lessons do we need to learn from that?
Thank you very much for that question. So obviously, as you know, Ash Wales and obviously the Welsh Government have been at the forefront of implementing smoke-free spaces. We campaigned for smoke-free playgrounds on a voluntary basis, smoke-free school gates on a voluntary basis, and luckily, you know, the foresight of Welsh Government has made that legislation when it comes to hospital grounds, playgrounds and sports ground and mental health units and a raft of other smoke-free spaces. So we obviously are very delighted that the Welsh Government has implemented that legislation. It has made a huge difference in the fact that it's allowed a platform for communicating the messages that it's not okay to smoke around children. Is a huge, and there's a massive amount of public support for that messaging as well. So we've had an opportunity to communicate that message. And then when it comes to smoke-free hospital grounds, I think there's a lot of us are looking at that legislation and the possibility of implementing that legislation. And in Wales, we've obviously had that in place since 2021. And what we would say around that, the lessons that we've learned are that there has to be a package when it comes to the implementation, and we can't just legislate. We need to be looking at the support that is in hospitals for smokers to quit. So that we need to have trained staff, we need to have enforcement on the ground. So there needs to be a whole raft of package that comes with that legislation. And I think that's the enormous lesson that we learned, because we implemented that legislation in 2021. Obviously, it was in the midst of COVID, which was tricky, but we had problems around enforcement, and we've had problems around compliance. It's a very different kind of legislation or tobacco policy from the other smoke-free spaces. So the other smoke-free spaces, you know, playgrounds, sports grounds, you know, and other areas like that, there's a lot of compliance. But when it comes to hospital grounds, you have to do a bit more of the legwork. But it is well worth it, because what comes with that is also that on-site hospital support when it comes to stopping smoking. The message to everybody who comes onto that hospital site that smoking is not okay, and that actually there is support available for if you want to quit. So it comes with a whole raft of other measures which support that smoke-free message.
Thank you.
Apologies, I should have called you before the Minister. So.
Thank you, Jack. The current advice, which was reiterated by the Chief Medical Officer in our last session, is that if you don't vape, not to vape, but if you smoke, vaping may be a better alternative. How will the measures in this bill, make it easier or harder for that message to be conveyed to the public who smoke?
Crucial question as this bill progresses, and also was touched on by the Chief Medical Officers, that the nature of this bill is that we are taking powers across a range of areas which we know will help us to prevent the uptake of vaping among children, which we're all concerned about. So restricting the marketing of vapes, the way that they are branded, it takes powers around the design of products, and also gives us some powers in relation to flavours. And it is important that those powers, as was discussed in the last session, are broad in the bill and defined through further consultation and regulation, giving us that flexibility to shape that policy going forward. We know from our experience in reducing smoking among children that the things that will work are reducing the appeal, reducing the availability, and reducing the affordability of products. And this bill, alongside the excise tax, which is planned for 2026, will take us, a long way, I think, on that journey to addressing those aspects and reducing the appeal among children. But also, we do want to ensure that the products remain available for adult smokers to switch to. And we know from our own research that adult smokers have got very inaccurate views at the moment about the relative harms from vaping compared to smoking. And I think part of the issue there is the way in which products are being branded and pushed in people's faces as they go into every corner shop up and down the country. Is it prevents the understanding that these might be valuable for smoking cessation, and promotes the idea that they are a kind of lifestyle choice for teenagers. I think removing the branding, removing the displays in shops, etc., will allow the message that these could be valuable to help people stop smoking. It will allow that message to land more easily than it currently does, and helpfully, realign those misperceptions and get us back to the position we were in, say, 2019, 2020, where basically these products were being used as a smoking cessation tool and were not really being used by other groups in the population. If we can get back to that, that would be the ideal scenario, and hopefully this legislation takes us a bit closer to that.
How do you think this bill will address the health inequalities? We've heard that smoking is more prevalent in groups of the poorer individuals than it is in richer individuals. Will the bill help address that?
I'll go and then would you
yeah. I think we see so closely that socioeconomic inequalities and smoking rates are closely patterned. Our Scotland's work with low-income communities in Scotland suggests that people regret beginning tobacco but find it hard to move away from it. But they also identified the dangers of these less regulated novel products such as e-cigarettes in enticing their children and grandchildren into the kind of addiction that they themselves so regret. And I think one of the real strengths in this bill is the ability to bring in some of these tobacco-related products into the kinds of control and regulation that we have fought so hard over decades to get for tobacco products.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Sadiq Al-Hassan.
Thank you, Chair. Do you think the introduction of a generational ban on smoking could cause an increase in the use of other nicotine products like vapes or smoke-free tobacco?
So obviously the purpose of the legislation is to reduce smoking, and the projections done by the department in the impact assessment, very clearly show that, even on conservative estimates, that it will achieve that goal over time. So the question then is, does it lead to displacement into other products? Given that the legislation is comprehensive in relation to tobacco products, it's to be hoped it won't lead to displacement into other kinds of tobacco products. But it may be that it does lead to some displacement into other nicotine products. So, as the Chief Medical Officer was saying in the previous session, it is unlikely that nobody takes up smoking in the affected age group. Some people will. Some of the 15-year-olds who will be affected by this legislation have already tried smoking. So, we need there to be a legal nicotine product that those people will be able to use. With the restrictions that are coming into place in relation to vaping and other nicotine products in this legislation, overall, one wouldn't expect the overall consumption of nicotine to be greater than it otherwise would be, if that makes sense. But there may be some displacement into other nicotine products as we transition away from sort of smoked tobacco and tobacco being used widely in that group.
So I think the dual use is a real concern in Scotland. So nearly 43% of people are dual using cigarettes and cigarettes and e-cigarettes. And the international longitudinal cohort evidence clearly shows a higher risk of progression to using combustible tobacco for young people that start vaping. So I think this legislation has the real potential to move us away from that.
I think we've also got to remember that the killer in the room is tobacco, and it's not, that is the generational ban is the most crucial part of this legislation that we need to push forward. So we need to keep our eye on the ball when we're looking at the health impact and the public health impact, potential public health impact of this bill, and make sure that we focus on that tobacco use and driving down that tobacco use.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Suzanne has just said, tobacco is the issue. And it was repeated multiple times in the previous session of the impact of tobacco. And for young people who start, they continue and they find it very difficult to stop. So if we can sort that, that is a great first step. There may be a small move into other nicotine products, but we can work on that. But tobacco is the one that kills.
Thank you. As is my job, remind everybody that we are finishing at 10:55, which is in about 15-minute time, isn't it? Thereabouts. And I've got 6 people who wish to ask questions. So can I ask if the questions are as tight as possible and the responses as tight as possible as well? Thanks. Becky Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks so much for being here. I just wanted to take you back to a conversation you were having with a previous questioner about smoking cessation in hospitals. I just wanted to ask if you could give us your thoughts around vaping availability in hospitals that allow people who are quitting in hospital or want to continue quitting to continue vaping. And our CMOs said about a smoke-free place being a vape-free place. And I just wondered if you could talk about your thoughts about vaping in hospitals where it's a smoke-free place and access to vapes. Thank you.
In Wales, then, obviously we've implemented smoke-free legislation. We've got 7 different health boards and various kinds of approaches to that legislation when it comes to the implementation alongside vaping. So when it comes to indoor spaces, there's already a huge amount of compliance with voluntary bans in those areas, and people generally don't smoke in indoor spaces. So there's already that kind of that public consensus in those areas. When it comes to the outdoor spaces, with regards to smoking and vaping, there is not necessarily a consistent approach across Wales, which can cause confusion amongst the public. I think that we need to be considering this very carefully when it comes to providing as much support to smokers as possible in these areas, and we need to be considering exemptions to vape-free spaces in those areas where where smoke-free spaces are, in particular in hospital settings, mental health units, and places where vulnerable patients who smoke are situated. So that would be the message, that we need to really consider those exemptions.
In Scotland, we put medicinally therapeutic products front and centre with smoking cessation. So smoking cessation is vital, but I think we need to remember that there is no medicinally licensed e-cigarette product globally anywhere in the world, and that medicinally licensed products have a very different setup. So you're talking with e-cigarettes about over 30,000 different variants listed with MHRA, 4 or 5 generations of devices, very, very different health profiles. Most of the comparisons are made with the toxins in tobacco. There are different additional toxins in e-cigarettes, and there is new research, for example, AI modelling the impacts of heating some of the chemicals in e-cigarettes to vapour point, where they produce highly toxic outcomes. And I think we need to bear that in mind. We also need to look at the research on air quality, because e-cigarettes conclusively contain the kind of particulates that we worry about with air quality that cause harm to health. And that is an issue, I think, arguing for vape-free spaces. So in Scotland, we are not We are supporting people to quit smoking whatever way works for them. We are supporting individuals, but we are only actively recommending medicinally licensed products because they have that context of appropriate use and safety and quality control, which e-cigarettes don't have.
Chair, just really to follow up on that point, because I know in the clause 12 of the bill is actually going to have a ban on vending machines for vaping, but I know there's been mental health units trusts who've said that actually they would call for that to be exempted. So is that one of the exemptions that you would go for and actually allow perhaps the vending machines in hospitals? Or?
I think we need to consider the smoker at the heart of, you know, and the vulnerable smoker when you're and how they're managing to abstain from that addiction. You know, it comes back to that addiction all the time, doesn't it? As you know, smoking is and nicotine is such an addictive substance that you can't. You know, it's very difficult just to tell somebody that they can't do it. You need to give them the right support and the support that they want. When it comes to choice, that's where we need to be looking at what their choices are and how they choose to move away from that deadly tobacco use.
On the mental health settings, I mean, we've done a lot of work in England with mental health trusts, and vending machines have been one way that they have been facilitating access to vapes in quite a large number of mental health trusts. So it's certainly something that we would be interested in looking at, because it will make that, you know, it's a bit more challenging for them to implement smoke-free policies in mental health settings if the vending machine rule applies across across the NHS estate. But also going back to Dr. Cooper's question, the mental health settings and those places where vulnerable smokers are, vapes have been really important in England in facilitating. We don't have legislation in relation to smoke-free grounds in England, but obviously it is the policy across the NHS estate that they do be smoke-free, and allowing vaping, particularly in those mental health settings, has been very facilitative of creating smoke-free grounds and supporting those people to maintain their smoke-free status as they move out of mental health settings as well.
Scotland already has a ban on vending machines for e-cigarettes and has had for some years.
Thank you. Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning. And I noticed in your submission that you have a recommendation that the government make good on their pledge to publish a roadmap to a smoke-free country, and with a strong focus on tackling inequalities. I'm from the North East region. We have high deprivation and high smoking prevalence, but it's the only region that has a clear vision, if you like, and declaration from Fresh and Directors of Public Health for how to achieve a smoke-free country. How important do you see, or could you explain a bit more why we need that vision and that strategy going forward?
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I mean, the legislation is fantastic. It is world leading, it is brilliant, and it will really set us on that path towards being a smoke-free country. But it will not be the last word in how that's achieved. We have 6 million smokers across this country. We need to make sure that all of our agencies are lined up to do the job that they need to do to help those people to stop smoking. The NHS, local government, integrated care boards, across the system, that we have the right approach. And we also need to make sure that the funding is there to do that too, that the government is committed to the funding into stop smoking services in local government, but we also need to see that funding around mass media campaigns. Chief Medical Officer was talking earlier about people's sort of waning understanding around the harms of second-hand smoke. Well, one of the ways of addressing that would be to be back on TV and radio and explaining to people what the harms of second-hand smoke are. So, that package of measures alongside this legislation would really help us to accelerate progress, because the bill is going to massively raise the saliency of the harms of smoking with the public. There's no doubt about that. There will be, there has been and there will continue to be a strong public debate around the measures in this bill. Being able to really ride the wave of that public understanding through that coherent strategy and that investment, we can really see smoking rates start to drop, and particularly in those disadvantaged populations where we continue to have these persistently high levels of smoking.
Steinbank.
Thank you, Chair.
by restricting vaping products in this bill in some of the same ways that tobacco products are currently restricted, be that packaging, display or potentially flavourings, as we discussed with the CMOs earlier, do you think this will lead to greater public and, I think quite crucially, greater misconceptions by current smokers about the relative harm between the two products?
So we've obviously got an issue when it comes to the understanding and the misconceptions around the harms of vaping, and in particular, the most worrying is the stats are amongst our smokers, considering them as harmful or more harmful than tobacco, and that is a significant issue. What this legislation does, it allows us to reset that clock and actually promote these products as smoking cessation products. Using health professionals to promote these products. Getting the right language around them, rather than being seen as a recreational toy, being seen as a product that is going to help people to quit smoking, and that is absolutely essential when it comes to the positioning of these products. So readdressing those misconceptions and replacing this product. When we talk about standardised packaging, what we did with tobacco was that we put it in the ugliest packaging that you could ever imagine. We're not talking about that when it comes to the vaping products. We're talking about plain packaging, something that is informative, but not necessarily attractive to young people. There's a big difference between something that is repulsive and something that's not attractive. So that's where we see that difference, and that's where we see this legislation coming into its own, really, and allowing us to reset and to have that different conversation.
And I'm sure we'll tease more of it out through the consultation process that will follow this legislation. But some of the early research that's been done has sort of indicated that you can, to some extent, have your cake and eat it on this. If we remove some of the attractive branding elements on packaging, which we know are appealing to children, it does reduce the appeal of the products to children, but it doesn't damage their appeal to adult smokers, and it doesn't damage harm misperceptions. So we can progress with this legislation via the consultation, looking properly at the evidence to make sure that we hit that balance right. But also there are provisions in the bill to allow public health bodies to do marketing, to do public health messages around vapes as a smoking cessation tool. And it will be important that the Department of Health the ASA work with public health bodies to make sure that they have the right guidance in order to be able to do that and give smokers, the right information about how this can be used as a cessation tool.
Thank you. I'm afraid this will probably be the next or the last question before the next session. So can I call Tristan Osborne? We have about 2.5 minutes left.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Going back to my question earlier on product displacement, which you've alluded to, you said there's a concurrent evidence that people who are smoking are also vaping. Is there any evidence that there might be a Cobra effect with this, where because we're banning disposable vapes, we're increasing the price of vaping, that actually you might see people then return back to the product you were originally trying to get them off of? And has there been any conversation in this space around what the evidence would be to show this would be a success beyond overall smoking reducing?
I have to pick that up. Currently vapes are much less expensive than smoking, and that's the kind of gap we need to maintain. So as the excise tax comes into force in October 2026 is its planned enforcement date, the intention is to raise the tax on tobacco at the same time to maintain the price differential, and that's crucial. Like, we do want to find a sweet spot for the price of these products that make the entry level for young people, for non-smokers, higher, so that it's a dissuasive technique, so that people who don't need to be using these products are not using them. But we obviously want to continue for them always to be cheaper than smoked tobacco and combusted tobacco, so that there is always that incentive for people to switch from the more harmful to the less harmful. So I think as it's been repeatedly said, there's flexibility in this legislation. It allows us to calibrate, and particularly it allows us to, which the previous bill did not, to regulate around product design and sort of the size of products. You know, so you could, for example, look to make them more expensive by changing the size of the minimum size of the amount of liquid that could be sold, for example. But all of this needs to be looked at going forward once the bill has passed. You know, there's an awful lot of work to be done to calibrate around things like price, the branding, etc., as the bill passes and we move on to the secondary regulations.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. I do apologise. I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring the session to a close, given that the time has been used up. So I'd like to thank our witnesses. I'm sorry for interrupting. I'd like to thank our witnesses, Hazel, Cheeseman, Sheila, Duffy, Suzanne and Naomi, Thompson, for their evidence, and again, the questions that have been asked. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, it can be a bit curt if you're not careful. It can be a bit curt if you're not careful. Yes. Absolutely. Thank you. So we now have the third panel of witnesses from now till 11:25, and so we'll hear evidence from Dr. Ian Walker, who is Executive Director of Policy at Cancer Research UK, and Sarah Sleet, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Asthma and Lung UK. And as I say, we'll have till 11:25. Questions? Andrew Gwynn? I was trying to get your attention.
Sorry.
Have you got any questions you want to ask? Fire away.
Of course. Thank you, Chair. First question is, what effects do vapes have on the health and lungs of young people? And do you think the bill will help to reduce the take-up of vaping in children?
In general, there is very little evidence around vaping, and we need a really considerable effort to get the evidence in place. But what we do know is that nicotine in general is not healthy for children, and vaping nicotine products is not going to be good news. We have some evidence about the harms that it causes. We know nicotine in particular is very problematic for very young children and developing brains. But we don't have the same level of evidence base that we do have with tobacco. And that is why I think with this bill and the precautionary approach that it takes in terms of restricting access for children and attractiveness to children is very important.
Smoking is a huge cause of cancers. Do you expect this bill will reduce the number of cases of cancer and increase the age of people that get cancer across the country?
Yes, so firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And I would absolutely just like to start by thanking Parliament for boldly introducing this bill, and I think it genuinely is world leading, and I've spoken to organisations across the world who are envious of the position that we find ourselves in. It's a very important question, and absolutely yes, I think the answer is that this bill would be very important in terms of reducing the number of cancers caused by smoking tobacco. We know there's no bigger thing that we could do to actually influence that going forward over the next generation and generations thereafter. As you've heard before this morning, we know that we still have 6 million people smoking across the UK, and we know that we can expect hundreds of thousands of cases of cancer caused by smoking over the term of the next Parliament. So as we move towards a truly smoke-free generation over the next 20, 30, 40 years, we absolutely will expect to see the number of cancers caused by smoking reduce, and of course alongside that the number of other illnesses and associated illnesses disorders associated with smoking as well.
Andrew Gwynn.
Good morning, both. Can you tell us about the evidence on the impacts of second-hand smoking on, in your case, Dr. Walker, cancer, and in your case, Sarah, on asthma and lung conditions? And what difference do you think the measures outlined in this bill will have on those conditions?
To start with smoking and cancer, the links between passive smoking and cancer, particularly lung cancer, are very clear. I think it's fair to say there is less evidence around different scenarios that you might predict through this bill, so different outdoor environments, etc. But that's more because those studies haven't necessarily been done, so it's an absence of evidence rather than evidence of absence, I think is an important point to make. So you heard from CMO this morning, CMO of England, that if you can smell cigarette smoke, you are exposed to it. The direct risk is then linked to how long you're exposed to it, how concentrated that environment is, how close you are to it, etc. But nevertheless, passive smoking is harmful, not just for cancer, but for vulnerable people with many other conditions as well. And so we're very much supportive of the new introduction of smoke-free places and the ability to restrict people smoking in particular outdoor spaces.
When it comes to people with lung conditions, secondhand smoke is incredibly important. It's a well-known risk factor, very severe risk factor for people with lung conditions. About 1 in 5 of us in the UK will experience a lung condition. There's something like over 7 million people with asthma. There's about 1.6 million people living with COPD. Those are two major conditions which are profoundly affected by second-hand smoking, and they are clear risk factors in terms of deaths from asthma, in terms of people having to go into hospital with exacerbations. So it's incredibly important that we deal with this issue of second-hand smoking. People, again, very much said earlier about there's no choice about second-hand smoking, and yet these are profoundly affecting people's lung conditions. So it's incredibly important that we make sure that we protect those vulnerable people as far as possible. And I think one thing we would say is that when it comes to the discussion around how far we should go in terms of smoke-free places and vape-free places, I think we would consider perhaps going further than has been suggested already and looking at other areas to make smoke-free. I know there has been discussion about hospitality and trying to get that balance right between the economic impact, potential impact that's been talked about if we make smoke-free places in outside hospitality places. However, we think the balance between the public health impact and what we have seen with smoke-free indoor spaces and the impact on business, actually we could go further and we should go further there.
The bill takes powers to introduce restrictions on vaping, which obviously will be subject to consultation after the bill receives royal assent. What factors do you think will need to be taken into consideration as part of that further consultation?
Go first, because obviously for people with asthma and lung conditions, they're at that kind of that piece in the middle where they're affected both by smoking and by vaping, and it is really important to get the balance right. Smoking is terrible. It's terrible for people with lung conditions, and we need to make sure that we can drive down smoking rates as far as possible. Vaping can play a part in helping with smoking cessation, but it should only be used for smoking cessation. People who've never smoked, children, should definitely not be taking up vaping. We see vaping as a staging post to being completely nicotine-free. And so it's important to get this kind of balance right between making vaping available for those who need smoking cessation, but equally not encouraging people to try vaping, or indeed to stay longer than they need be on vaping. So the legislation is good in giving that flexibility for adjusting over time as we get more evidence in. It's really important to put evaluation in place and to make sure robust evaluation does flow through over time so that we can adjust to respond to that. And traditionally, certainly in respiratory diseases, there has not been enough research and evaluation around those generally. So we need to correct that now.
Yeah, and if I could just add, so firstly, just to confirm that we're very much supportive of taking those powers. And also, I think one of the real strengths of the bill is the ability to adjust and moderate and titrate those powers and the actions that we take over time. Not just as new evidence emerges, but also as tobacco industry and new products may emerge to try and circumvent regulations in place. So a really important part of the bill. In terms of what's important to consider through that consultation, which I think was the crux of the question, then from our perspective, it really is important to get a balanced perspective, a balanced view on what the right actions are in this area. So, of course, we all agree we want to limit and reduce and stop access to children and young people. We want to limit appeal to never smokers, but balancing that very carefully with making these products, cessation tools, available for people who are trying to quit. And, really important not to forget those 6 million people who are current smokers and the long-term health implications that are ahead of those people. And we need to balance making it as easy as possible for those people to quit when they've chosen to do so. So there'll be many kind of balancing features, many balancing points of evidence that will be really important through that consultation in coming to the right outcome.
In a nutshell, how important is it that the measures in this bill are passed?
From a cancer perspective, there is no single bigger action, I don't think, that you could take to reduce the cancer burden on the country going forwards. And, the cancer burden sits at a very personal, individual level for people getting their own diagnosis. It's at a family level, at a friend level. It also sits at an economic level for the country, and it also sits at an NHS level in terms of the burden that smoking-related illnesses cause on the NHS. So, from my perspective, this, as I said earlier, is a world-leading piece of legislation. And it is absolutely an opportunity for generational change and a long-term legacy that will see our children and our grandchildren never being able to legally buy tobacco in the UK, never being exposed to the harms that will cause them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sadiq Al-Hassan.
Thank you. Is there any research into passive vaping risks to bystanders who haven't got a choice if someone is vaping next to them?
So, as I said earlier, the research evidence around vaping is actually currently very poor in terms of harms. There hasn't been enough. It takes a long time to build up evidence over things that are generally very progressive rather than an immediate impact. So we are going to have to wait. We need to put in place that evidence, and we're going to have to wait to get that evidence back. We know anecdotally from people that are beneficiaries and people that contact the organisation, that there are reports of people who are in, particularly in closed spaces, but also sometimes outside, where there's a concentration of vaping going on. The classic, you go through the door and suddenly everybody around you is vaping immediately outside the door. We do get reports from people that exacerbates their particularly asthma, but sometimes COPD. But it is anecdotal, and we really do need that evidence base to support what is happening there.
The only thing I would add specifically from a cancer perspective is, again, very little long-term evidence because the products haven't been around long enough and the cumulative effects have not been seen yet. What we do know is that based on the current evidence, vapes are far less harmful than cigarettes. So the advice that you heard earlier, which is if you smoke, you're better to vape or take other nicotine products. If you don't smoke, don't vape, because we don't know yet what the long-term effects will be. And particularly in terms of bystander and effects of vaping, again, are very light on evidence at the minute in terms of what the impacts of that will be.
Ewan Steinbeck.
There's a substantial health impact on people working in sectors that unavoidably encounter second-hand smoke in the course of their employment. And what will be the impact of this bill, the measures in this bill on this?
Yeah, so again, I think the impact of the bill will reach every sector on the face of it. So obviously the aim of making a smoke-free UK will impact everybody, whichever sector. But I think you're probably referring to smoke-free places specifically in terms of increasing the places where smoking is not allowed. For people who are exposed unavoidably by their working environment, of course, this will be good news and a good expansion. And as you heard from Sarah earlier on as well, recognise that we didn't quite get to hospitality in the bill, but it'd be interesting as we go through consultation to review the evidence and understand the sentiment. Clearly people working in hospitality are likely to be exposed to smoke in their work environment, even if that's outside. I think again the bill makes important steps in terms of increasing the number of smoke-free places and reducing exposure to tobacco smoke.
Yeah, I would just add to that as the CMO said earlier, it's about duration as well as the kind of density of smoking. So if you are working in hospitality and you're working in those outdoor spaces, clearly the duration is going to be longer. If you are working in a coach sort of concourse, you are going to be exposed for longer. So I think it is really important to remember that. Equally, I think one of the other issues is about inequality, and there is a concentration of sort of working lives which are more exposed to second-hand smoking, which is exacerbated by inequality.
Somewhat building off that, and I know some of the evidence submitted talked about the evidence on the gateway effect and how perhaps there isn't that evidence to suggest there's a transition from one to the other. But I wonder, just from your respective organisational perspectives, are you still concerned about the increase in vaping, even amongst those groups who have not previously smoked cigarettes?
It's a tricky one. Again, we know that there is a lot of people who are using vaping to get off of smoking. They end up dual using for a while, and then some move on to just vape, and then some eventually move on completely away from it. I think what we would want to see, we seriously need a really comprehensive programme around nicotine cessation and smoking cessation to support people on that journey and to make sure that they go on that journey and then they don't come back in. We heard earlier from Ash in Wales about some measures, really good measures put in place, but without that wider context in place, it's really hard to cement the behaviour that's needed to move completely away from this. So we need to think very broadly about the whole support structure to help people get off smoking and then eventually move away from nicotine altogether.
I would agree, and I think, I guess what I would just come back to, and again, the real kind of killer in the room, if you like, is again cigarettes and tobacco, and there's no safe way of consuming tobacco, and so actually the alternative of smoking versus vaping is very clear, and even though we don't know the long-term health implications of vapes, we know that you're much better off vaping than you are smoking. Having said that, of course, we don't want young people and never smokers to be vaping either. And again, I think the power of the legislation is the double-pronged approach, one which is around preventing people from ever smoking in the first place by raising the age of sale by 1 year every year, but alongside that putting in place a comprehensive package of measures to control vaping, and particularly access to vaping and appeal of vapes to young people to reduce the uptake in those communities as well. So I think all of those things together, alongside, and you'll forgive me for saying, but alongside, of course, the investment that will be required around smoking cessation services, the investment that will be required around enforcement, supporting border force, HMRC, retails, etc., will be really important components of this bill and its ability to drive the change that it can.
Jim Dixon.
Thank you for all the work you've done to advocate for smoke-free legislation. Can I just ask you about differential smoking rates in different parts of the country, and therefore under this legislation, which parts of the country you see as likely to benefit most as we see a decline in smoking rates and a decline in tobacco use more generally.
So if I just kick off, because health inequalities are profound when it comes to lung disease. And we know that the top three conditions with the biggest gap between health outcomes between sort of rich and poor are actually lung conditions. So they're asthma, COPD, and lung cancer, all profoundly affected by smoking. And for those areas that are socially and economically deprived, smoking is concentrated in those areas. So if you are in the poorest part of the country, you are twice as likely to be smoking as you are in the richest part of the country. And it's even more profound in certain segments. We heard about young mothers, 4 times more likely to be smoking if you're in a poorer part of the country than a richer part. So if we can drive down smoking, and particularly for young people, then the impact is greatest on those areas which are most in need of help and support and social. So this, in fact, is probably one of the biggest things that could be done in terms of tackling health inequalities. And for that reason, I think the bill is probably the most important public health measure that has been passed through Parliament in a very, very long time.
At CRUK, and well, thank you for the question, because I think this is a really critical question as well. But we've done a lot of research and work into cancer inequalities, which are obviously part of that broader health inequalities. And they generally mirror similar trends. For cancer, we know that people in the most deprived communities have higher incidence of cancer. They typically present at later stage. They typically engage less with screening. They typically have worse outcomes, and they typically don't get the optimal treatment as well. So it's a pretty difficult story right along the pipeline. But the reasons behind that can be very complex and involve lots of different things. But actually, despite all of that, the one thing that we do know is that smoking is a really significant contributor to those health inequalities. The higher smoking rates in children and young people in those communities, those most deprived communities. So it's very clear from the evidence that the most deprived communities across the UK are the ones that will suffer most, if you like, from the impacts of tobacco. So this bill is clearly not a magic switch. It will not change those things overnight, but what it does is sets us on that pathway to fundamentally reversing some of those inequalities and to reducing some of the cancer inequalities that we see across the UK. And alongside the important measures in the bill, a really clear kind of targeted set of actions around health marketing interventions in those communities, effectively funding cessation services where we need them most, will all contribute to getting those health inequalities reduced much more quickly and much more effectively. So again, a very positive story in terms of the potential impact on health inequalities.
If in that case, thank you very much for that. In that case, if there aren't any other questions from members, I'd like to thank the witnesses, Ian Walker from Cancer Research UK and Sarah Sleet from Asthma and Lung UK. So that brings an end to our morning session, and the committee will meet again at 2 p.m. this afternoon here in the Booth Road room to continue taking oral evidence. So I would invite the Minister or the Whip to move the adjournment.
There you go.
I'd like to move that this House to now adjourn.
Thank you. The question is that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned. As of many of that opinion, say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order.